Omang, Charlie Smith, Jong Benji, Georgia Strait. I'm the editor of the Georgia Strait, and I'm very happy to be back for another week on WOW TV. Month of May across Canada is Asian Heritage Month. And of course, Vancouver, with its very large Asian population, there are a whole series of events happening. But one of the cornerstones of Asian Heritage Month this year is the 100th anniversary of the arrival of a ship called the Komagata Maru into Vancouver Harbor on May 23rd, 1914. And this boat was chartered by a man named Gurdit Singh, and he was bringing, there were 376 passengers on the boat of South Asian descent. More than 350 of them came from India, and they stopped in Hong Kong for supplies because it's a long way to go from India to Vancouver, and then they arrived in Vancouver Harbor. But there was a problem because there was racist legislation at the time. It was continuous migration legislation, which meant that people could only come to Canada by ship if they had one trip and they never stopped. And this was legislation that was created earlier to actually stop people coming from the Indian subcontinent. And it was because of a desire by Canada at the time to make the country less Asian. And it's actually quite a shameful period in Canadian history. So this boat arrived in the harbor, the Komagata Maru, Japanese vessel actually, but it was chartered by an Indian named Gurdit Singh. And the immigration authorities would not allow the passengers to disembark. So they were stuck on the boat. And they were stuck in the harbor for 2 months, and the local Sikh community, the local Indian community, really rallied to the passengers' defense. And what they would do is they would go out in the water, bring food, bring supplies, while these passengers were on the boat. The immigration, one of the top people was an inspector named William Hopkinson, who didn't want the passengers to disembark. And so you had this standoff in the harbor for a long time. And Gurdit Singh, in a lot of ways, is seen as a hero by many people because what he was doing was challenging the law by chartering the vessel. This was a deliberate act to challenge the law. And one of the things that's interesting about the legislation, and why did we have this continuous migration legislation, was the British Empire. Canada was a dominion, so it was still under the British Empire, even though it was an independent country. But you had Britain controlling India. And so the Indians in India didn't have very many rights. And they were agitating for more political rights, independence, and Britain was trying to keep India under control. And there was a lot of opium production, and the opium was being shipped to China, and that was causing concerns in China because the Chinese government was not happy about that. They wanted to curtail the export of opium. So all of this was interrelated, what was happening in China, what was happening in India, and then this vessel coming to Canada and the law trying to stop people from India from coming to Canada. They also took away the vote from Indians, and that was another, in Canada, and that was another means, these are people from South Asia, so that they didn't have greater rights in Canada than they were having in India. So eventually what happened, 2 months later, on July 23rd, the vessel was ordered out of the harbor. It was sent back to India, landed in Calcutta, and there was a confrontation with British troops. 19 people were shot, and that is what is known in history as the Komagata Maru incident. And so there are shows right now commemorating that at the Surrey Museum. There's also a show at the Vancouver Maritime Museum. There are theater productions about it at UBC. There's a discussion at the Carnegie Center. There's just a whole host of events in the month of May, in Asian Heritage Month, to commemorate this. And another thing that I find interesting is, in connection with Asian Heritage Month, is there's a new book that has been released called Trouble on Main Street, Mackenzie King, Reason, Race, and the 1907 Vancouver Riots. And this is by a University of Toronto historian named Julie Gilmore. And this book actually traces the roots of some of the issues connected to the Komagata Maru incident. So if you go back to 1907, what was happening in Vancouver? Well, we had terrible race riots. A group called the Anti-Asiatic exclusion league, went into Chinatown, went into Japantown. Japantown was the area along Powell Street. And basically, a mob of agitators went smashing windows. And they were actually kind of encouraged by a Seattle labor agitator named A.E. Fowler. And the labor unions in the U.S. were very opposed to Japanese immigration, Chinese immigration as well, more Japanese. And even the president of the U.S. at the time, Theodore Roosevelt, was very hostile to Japan, and there was talk that they might even have war at that time. The problem was Britain, and remember Canada is a dominion of Britain, Britain was an ally of Japan. And Britain and Japan had a treaty, and it was related to the Japanese defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. So you have all these global currents going on. You've got the British and the Japanese having a good relationship, the Americans and the Japanese having a bad relationship, and then you throw into it U.S. labor agitators coming up to Vancouver and whipping up a riot, and they go to Chinatown, and there was also a terrible economy in 1907, smashing windows, a lot of damage to the businesses and to the homes, and then they went to Japantown, this mob, but what they encountered there was resistance. The Japanese fought back. And there were pitched battles in the streets. The police had to come, massive amount of damage. So the federal government had a problem. The prime minister at the time was Sir Wilfrid Laurier. Sir Wilfrid Laurier, you might remember, is on the Canadian $5 bill. And he was a conciliator as a prime minister. He was from Quebec, a liberal. And he had a problem because Britain was upset, the Japanese were upset, and it also didn't look very good on Canada that mobs could go into the street and start smashing windows and causing all sorts of havoc. We were very lucky that nobody died in the riot because that could have happened quite easily. So what does Wilfrid Laurier do? He has a commission of inquiry to assess damages. And he appoints a young deputy minister of labor named Mackenzie King. And you may know the name Mackenzie King. He's on the $50 bill. And he eventually became a Liberal Prime Minister himself. So Julie Gilmore's book, Trouble on Main Street, covers what happened with Mackenzie King looking at the riots in Japantown and Chinatown. And what he did was he advocated compensation for the victims. So Mackenzie King actually forged some pretty good relations with the Japanese government and with the Chinese government once he made that recommendation. There were no subsequent riots, but there was a lot of fear of that. But at the same time, in the course of his investigation, he became aware of the American concerns about Japan and the militarism. Britain thought that Japan's ambitions at the time were in China, and Britain turned out to be correct. The Americans thought that the Japanese were going to take over the West Coast just with massive immigration and up until the Rocky Mountains. So what was happening was the Americans wanted to ban Japanese immigration, and the Canadians wanted to contain Japanese immigration. They'd already contained Chinese immigration with the head tax. So what happened in 1908 after the riot was the Canadian government sent someone to Japan, not Mackenzie King, and they negotiated agreement to curtail Japanese immigration to Canada. And then Mackenzie King went to England, and that was also related to him becoming aware of opium, because when he was looking at the Chinese issue, opium became an issue. So then he went to there, and then he went to India, and he went to China. He almost negotiated an end to the head tax, and that was covered in the book. What a Chinese official had said, cap it at 10,000, and we'll scrap the head tax. This was in 1909. Laurier came back and said, we want it capped at 1,000. China would have introduced a passport system. Talks broke down. It's a very sad thing that they never did reach an agreement, because there's been a lot of heartache since then, and that too will be covered in Asian Heritage Month. So a lot to think about in May, and I think if you can get to any of the Asian Heritage Month events, I would recommend you do so.